Hello everybody. In 2008, it is 60 years since the refugees' faithful exodus from Palestine and the birth of the refugee problem. This problem has since remained unresolved despite the UN General Assembly resolutions demanding their return. Despite 6 decades of continuing struggle for their rights, the bitter fact that refugees have never been able to return to their place of origin nor obtain basic civil rights in some host countries, like Lebanon. Today, there are about 4 million Palestinian refugees in Arab East. A large number of the refugees, especially camp dwellers, suffer from poverty, lack of civil rights, and live in the midst of intense social and political conflict. In the modern longest-standing refugee problem, refugees are caught between exile and alienation as non-citizens of host countries. On behalf of the Palestinian Refugee Camps program of Issam Fares Institute, I would like to welcome Professor Rex Brynen. We'll talk about refugees in the peace process and about options and obstacles. Rex Brynen is Professor of Political Science at McGillm University. I asked him before how do you pronounce McGill? It is a good pronunciation or not? This is a Quebecois pronunciation. So, and coordinator of Palestinian Refugee Research Net. You'll find it in the website of the university. Among his publications are Palestinian refugees, challenges of repatriation and development. It is co-edited with Rola Bai. We have it here. A very political economy, peace buildings and foreign aid in the West Bank and Gaza, 2000, and 6 other books on aspects of security and development in the Middle East. In addition of his academic work, Professor Brynen has served as a consultant to the CIDA, Canadian International Development Agency, the United States, the World Bank, and other agencies. Please join me in welcoming Rex Brynen.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Larry. Those of you who are recording it, I hope this is on. It's a great pleasure to be here today at AUB on the auspices of the Issam Fares Institute and the program on public policy and governance in housing refugee camps, which has done some excellent work, which has certainly been of use in my own research. What I intend to do today, and the title is kind of vague because actually when they called me and asked me for a title, I didn't know what I was going to say, so I thought of something that was broad enough that it would cover any possible eventuality. What I'm going to really offer today is not a sustained analysis of the refugee issue, but rather a sort of series of observations around a couple of clusters of issues. I'm much more interested in the sense of the discussion we can have after that than in what I might pronounce to you today. It's a little daunting too because there's a number of other people in the room that are included who work on refugees, and Rosemary, who knows more about refugees in her little finger than I know in my entire career. So I will try not to make a fool of myself. I want to start by talking about the refugee issue in the context of a long process on and off again of Palestinian-Israeli negotiations. And I'm not sure, in fact, that enough work has yet been done on what has and has not happened along the torturous history of Palestinian-Israeli negotiations and the refugee component of it. I've written a short paper that appears on the Chatham House website for those of you who are interested in a kind of fuller treatment of this, which also has at the end of it the negotiating texts from the various rounds of negotiations, so you can actually see what was being suggested on the Palestinian side, on the Israeli side, on the American side, and so on and so forth. So I'm going to start by saying a little bit about the negotiating process, what did and did not happen in the negotiating process. And we might discuss that later. There's a couple of other issues I want to mention too. The peace process, or peace process, depending on how cynical about it we might be, as you all know, began way back in Madrid in almost 18 years which have passed since then, which makes me feel rather old even to note that fact, there have been perhaps 4 serious or semi-serious efforts to come to terms to grapple with the refugee issue. The first, and in many ways the least serious effort to do so, was the Refugee Working Group, which was set up as part of the multilateral track of the peace process way back in 1991 and 92 when the Madrid process began. It ran from 1992 up until the late 1990s. It was chaired by Canada, and to be frank, it achieved very, very little. These were large meetings, lots of countries came, the discussions of the refugee issue were on a consensual basis. That meant, in effect, that the Israelis objected to any discussion whatsoever of the real core of the refugee issue, the real political issues at stake in the refugee issue, and the RWG therefore largely dealt with issues of living conditions and fundraising for various living conditions types initiatives. Second, and it's perhaps under-recognized now, the Oslo Agreement of 1993 addressed the refugee issue, and it did so in 2 regards. First of all, it postponed substantive discussion of the 1948 refugee issue off to permanent status negotiations, but it also contained an Israeli commitment, a commitment that the Israelis had first made back in the negotiations with Egypt in 1978, and was later also included in the treaty with Jordan. The Israelis also agreed to the return of 1967 displaced persons to the West Bank. That is to say, Palestinians not who fled in 1948 during the Nakba, but Palestinians who had fled or were outside of the West Bank in 1967 and had been unable to return. A number of which is in the several hundred thousands, depending on how you count them. Despite this formal agreement to allow their return and to negotiate the modalities of their return, in fact, a formal commitment has been made in 3 places now by Israel, that process went nowhere. There were a series of what were called quadripartite committee meetings after 1993, in which the Israelis deliberately stalled the issue, hung it up in debates over definition terms. Who was a displaced person? Did it include people who just left during the war? Did it include people who were trapped outside of the West Bank after the war, etc.? And 0, not a single person has ever returned to the West Bank under that component of Oslo, under that component of the Jordanian-Israeli Treaty, under that component of the 1978 Camp David commitment with Israel, has ever returned. So there was, in fact, and it gets forgotten now, a formal Israeli commitment on displaced persons, many of whom were also 1948 refugees, of not return to Israel, but return to the West Bank, but nothing ever happened. Third, there were the permanent status negotiations of 2000-2001, which comprised not only the very well-known Camp David negotiations of the summer of 2000, but also the previous 3 negotiations at Stockholm, the secret round that occurred in Stockholm, the subsequent secret rounds that occurred in Jerusalem and in Washington, the Clinton parameters, President Clinton's attempt to formulate a compromise formulation in December of 2000, and the Taba negotiations of January 2001. At Camp David, and despite a mythology which is sometimes developed over why Camp David failed, at Camp David there were essentially no refugee negotiations. The Israelis outlined their position, their opening maximalist position on refugees. The Palestinians outlined their opening maximalist position on refugees. They disagreed, and there was no real negotiation at all in the sense that we would ordinarily understand. Counter-proposals, give and take, and what have you. There was on other issues, on borders, territory, Jerusalem, but there really was no negotiation on refugees whatsoever at Camp David. In the period which followed the collapse of Camp David, of course the outbreak of the Intifada that fall, there were a series of almost constant secret negotiations. The negotiations didn't end at Camp David, they just shifted to other kinds of venues. And those negotiations, again, didn't really involve the Israelis and Palestinians making proposals and counter-proposals on the refugee issue, but did lead to the Americans finally, at the very end of Clinton's term in December, offering the Clinton parameters, which was the American attempt to outline a compromise middle ground position on all the issues, not just refugees, on all of the issues between the Palestinians and the Israelis. The Clinton parameters had a component that dealt with refugees, and it outlined some options, but the core proposal was this. Israel would accept a number of refugees to Israel, subject to Israel's sovereign discretion, so it would be entirely up to Israel as to how many refugees it would receive. And beyond that limited number, which was priority given to refugees from Lebanon, beyond that limited number, whatever it might be, there was no actual number suggested, refugees would return to repatriate to a Palestinian state, or they might stay in third host countries, or they might be absorbed through third country resettlement. There would also be compensation paid to all refugees, and all of this would be framed as fulfillment of UN General Assembly Resolution 194. So the political framing of the Clinton parameters was to agree on something in which there was symbolic only refugee return to 1948 areas to Israel. There are a number of other residential options. There was compensation, but it would all be framed as representing the fulfillment of 194. Of course, it wouldn't represent the fulfillment of 194, but that formulation was adopted in part because the Israelis have a very different interpretation of 194. They argued that it was simply a recommendation by the UN and has no binding content. And the Americans thought this was a nice way of trying to bridge the gap rhetorically, not in fact in practice. The Clinton parameters, not just with regard to the refugee issue, but the Clinton parameters on all the other issues, Jerusalem, territory, and so forth, were accepted by Israel, but with many reservations. Israel essentially gave a yes but answer to the Clinton parameters in December, January. On the Palestinian side, they were not accepted. Instead, the PLO asked for a series of clarifications and modifications. The Palestinian answer was a no but, so there was an Israeli yes but and an Israeli Palestinian no but. Despite that, the Clinton parameters became the basis for the last very substantive round of negotiations for permanent status of that part of the peace process in January 2001, when the Israelis and Palestinians sat down at Taba and negotiated shortly before the collapse of the electoral committee of Abu Barak and the Labour government. The Taba negotiations in January 2001 were the first very serious negotiations on the refugee issue, in which they got down to detail, drafting language, offering proposals, offering counter-proposals, and so forth. They made very substantial progress in the eyes of the two negotiating teams, and indeed the negotiating teams later said, privately but not publicly, that had they had enough time, they believed they could have come to an agreement on the refugee issue. It must be said that the negotiating teams on both sides consisted of particularly flexible groups of individuals. It is not entirely clear the extent to which their respective national leaderships would have bought on to what they agreed. And in many ways, I think their hope was that if they closed the deal on the refugee issue, as well as the deal being closed on everything else, in a sense, the national leaderships would accept it as part of the broader package. The Taba negotiations writ large, however, failed. They ended, and as you all know, in February of the following month, Ariel Sharon was elected as Prime Minister of Israel, and all permanent status negotiations came effectively to an end. So there was serious engagement on the refugee issue in this period of 2000-2001. It frankly came very, very late. It really didn't come until those 2 months of December, January, with the Clinton parameters and Taba. It's interesting to look at the Taba documentation. You can find it online, both the PLO position. You will find the Israeli non-paper, which is not the Israeli opening paper, but the Israeli attempt to incorporate the Palestinian position into a joint paper. And you can find the so-called mechanisms paper, which was an agreed joint negotiating text on the mechanisms for implementing a Palestinian refugee deal. There's quite a lot of interest there. Outside of official channels, after the collapse of permanent status negotiations at this period, many elements of the Taba negotiations, and indeed, and it's not a coincidence, many of the people who were at Taba became absolutely instrumental in the unofficial Geneva Accords that were negotiated by former officials on both sides and academics on both sides. The refugee teams were very similar to the people who had been at Taba. And in many ways, also, the Arab Peace Initiative of 2002 was crafted to reflect a Taba-type approach. And it's particularly noteworthy that the Arab Peace Initiative does not talk about the right of return. It talks about an agreed solution, and it talks about UN General Assembly Resolution 194, which, as I mentioned, from the time of Clinton and carried through to Taba, was the kind of revised way of framing a compromise deal. Now, of course, we have a long period of no negotiations whatsoever during the Sharon period, and it's not until the recent Annapolis round that began in November 2007 that the parties get back again to negotiating the refugee issue. That round extended, what we consider as a serious round of permanent status negotiations from November 2007 up until the recent Israeli elections. Here, in this round, the Israelis were much less generous than they had, not that they had been particularly generous at Taba, but were much less generous than they had in 2000-2001. Olmert apparently proposed to accept only 25,000 refugees over 10 years. The Taba numbers are ambiguous. They're somewhere between 25,000 and 125,000, depending on how we read the rather tortuous language of the proposal, with the intention being closer to the 3-figure side, the 6-figure side, the 5-figure side. So Olmert only proposed to accept 25,000 refugees over 10 years, or only 2,500 refugees a year for 10 years, with no recognition of the right of return. That's been an Israeli constant throughout. They don't like that language at all. And indeed, the Israelis preferred that most of the refugee issue be postponed to later, that there be an agreement on other territorial issues, but that the refugee issue, like Jerusalem, its final resolution be postponed to a later date. That, of course, is not a position to which Abu Mazen could or would agree, and as we know, the Annapolis round produced nothing in the way of agreement. We now, of course, have a new incoming Israeli government under Bibi Netanyahu and a Likud-led coalition, which I'll talk about in a minute. A few observations on this negotiating history. First, there has been substantial progress amongst academics, among some of the negotiating parties, amongst policy think tanks, and so forth, in thinking about the many technical aspects surrounding the refugee issue, the mechanics of a compensation system, the developmental challenges for a future Palestinian state in absorbing any returnees. Not all of this is in the public domain, but it is increasingly coming into the public domain. Will Rafai is there, and I co-edited a book on repatriation issues to the West Bank and Gaza, much of which, in fact, was a way of publishing previously unpublished World Bank studies on this issue. We have another book that we're working on right now on compensation issues. Really, over the last decade, there has been a tremendous increase in the amount of policy analysis and technical work that's relevant to permanent status negotiations. These technical issues are frankly very important. It is entirely possible that the parties at some future point, not anytime soon, I would have to say, but at some future point could agree to a peace agreement which is not implementable in practice. It is worth remembering that many peace agreements fall apart after their signing. The mere fact that you've signed an agreement doesn't in fact mean that it brings peace. All too often there's dispute over the terms and what's supposed to be a peaceful outcome collapses. So there has been progress on technical thinking, considerable progress on technical thinking. There has been much less progress on how to resolve the gap between the Palestinian framing position, which has been to demand Israeli recognition of the right of return and offering in exchange compromises on implementation of that right, which would effectively reduce the number of Palestinians who could return to 1948 areas who could return to Israel. That's been the Palestinian position. Recognize the right, and we can show flexibility and implementation, versus the Israeli position, which has been, we reject any notion of a right, but we are prepared to accept the return of limited numbers of refugees to Israel or on a symbolic basis. So the gap between those two sides has really not been reduced, despite this introduction of using UN General Civil Resolution 194 as a kind of rhetorical framing device that might appeal to both sides. Israel has steadfastly refused to accept moral responsibility for Nakba, for forced displacement in 1948, and for continued exile. And that is not just a negotiated position, that is deeply internalized on the Israeli side, and it's very hard to find Israelis who accept that there is an Israeli moral responsibility for the refugee issue. In some ways, actually, public opinion, elements of public opinion are more flexible than Israeli negotiators tend to be. Moreover, Israeli attitudes have hardened rather than softened since the collapse of the Camp David era, and we saw that not only in Olmert's proposals on refugees being less generous than what was being discussed at Taba, but Tzipi Livni's proposals on preferences on refugees was zero. I mean, her preference for return to Israel was zero. It wasn't 25,000 over 10 years. It was zero over forever. So there has been there has not been progress on that issue of return to 1948 areas. We've slipped back over the years since 2000, 2001. Third, and this is really sometimes difficult for people to fully comprehend, there is very little Israeli policy capacity on the refugee issue whatsoever. In the Israeli government, which can provide you with detailed statistics at the drop of a hat on orange exports or the range of surface-to-air missiles, there is not a single person in the entire Israeli government who does anything on refugees. There is no one who knows anything about refugees. And the total number of Israelis who follow the issue closely can be numbered on about one hand, and none of those people are currently in government. Some of them are people who were in government who were forced to learn about the refugee issue because they had to prepare for it for negotiations and became so fascinated by it that they keep doing it, even though they're now retired. But the Israelis just don't care. They just don't know anything about refugees at all. It is a non-issue for them. They negotiate about it, but it's not as if there are people in the foreign ministry or people at the Ministry of Defense or people at Justice Ministry who think about this issue unless they are forced to by their political leaders. This has been a big problem, frankly, in the negotiations. This is the one file on which the Israelis have been much worse prepared than the Palestinians have. Really, the Palestinians massively outclassed the Israelis in negotiations in technical knowledge of the refugee issue. The U.S. learns things, then forgets them. Strikingly so, largely because of foreign service rotation. That is to say, the Americans, by 2000, 2001, had begun to learn lots of things about refugees, and then by 2002, those people were all off at different posts and not dealing with refugees at all. So the U.S. has a remarkable capacity to learn, but it's kind of cyclic. When there's serious negotiations, suddenly a whole bunch of people on the State Department have to run around and find out about refugees, and they start consulting their people who deal with refugees in the Population Bureau, and then all kinds of gets forgotten again. A fourth observation, which I've already hinted at multiple times, and is the most pressing thing I will say tonight, is that there is absolutely no prospect whatsoever for successful negotiations on the refugee issue or any other permanent status issue with the emerging Israeli government. Now, I think that's a bit ambiguous formulation. Absolutely no prospect whatsoever. There isn't. There is no chance we are going to be moving forward on the refugee issue in the next X years, however long this Israeli government lasts, and it could well be a 2-term or 3-term Israeli government. We don't know. Indeed, I would argue that emerging Prime Minister Netanyahu does not, in fact, believe in a two-state solution whatsoever. Certainly, most of his coalition, when that finally crystallizes, doesn't. The irony is that Avigdor Lieberman is perhaps the only person who's now speaking in favor of a two-state solution. That's because he wants some way of getting the Palestinians out of Israel, not because he's particularly attached to the notion of a Palestinian state. And that is a reality I think we're all going to have to confront as we think about the Palestinian refugee issue. Even if we get something called a peace process, and the international community has an almost infinite capacity to convince itself that there is a peace process when there isn't one, we will not get, I will prepare to fearlessly predict that we will not get a resolution of the refugee issue in the term of this Israeli government or any Israeli government that looks much like this Israeli government. Now, that point is not only profoundly depressing for those of us who have been working on the refugee issue for a long time, but it also leads to two other sets of issues I want to touch on briefly before we throw it open for discussion. The first one of those is the future of UNRWA. UNRWA, as you know, is entering the 60th year of its existence. I've said some of my UNRWA friends at this rate will have to call that not UNRWA at 60, but UNRWA the next 60 years. As I suggested, there's unlikely to be progress on the refugee issue anytime soon. UNRWA's role will be as important as ever. In other words, if we're not going to make political progress on the refugee issue, then UNRWA is still going to be around, and what UNRWA does is going to continue to be important. Now, UNRWA is an imperfect organization, as many within the organization would be the first to admit. There are things it could certainly do more efficiently. However, it's important to recognize that it functions in an imperfect environment, often at the mercy of events that are beyond its control. It's asked to combine its primary functions of service delivery, routine service delivery, with periodic emergency humanitarian response, as we saw both at Beirut and we saw more recently in Gaza, as well as long-term development and reconstruction, as we now see it in BC, as we now see in Beirut, where essentially we have a large town, a town of 30,000, and the beginnings of a process of reconstruction. That's an odd thing for a UN agency to do. UN agencies don't usually do service delivery plus emergency response plus long-term development, but all of those things get thrown at UNRWA with no notice, simply because of regional and local events. Its achievements in health, education, and these other areas are demonstrable and often very impressive indeed. So UNRWA has its weaknesses, but UNRWA also does a remarkable job in many ways, given the environment in which it operates. But UNRWA is an organization under threat, I think, in two ways. The first is the growing budgetary crunch. Will it be able to secure adequate funding for both its core service delivery and for its emergency response and reconstruction activities? Will there be enough money, particularly in an era of economic recession, possibly depression, and tightening foreign aid budgets. How can it secure the necessary resources? And if it cannot secure those resources, what does it cut? That is the almost unescapable budgetary reality for UNRWA. Maybe what does it stop doing, or what does it do less of if there isn't enough money? So that's a serious challenge for UNRWA. UNRWA is also under unparalleled political challenge. The Israeli government, which at the best of times has a rather schizophrenic policy of simultaneous cooperation with UNRWA, interference with UNRWA, suspicion of UNRWA, and need for UNRWA, and they oscillate between all four of those depending on the circumstances, has been openly critical of it in recent weeks, largely as a byproduct of what happened in Gaza. In the U.S. in particular, pro-Israeli groups, more or less on their own, actually, not really with the encouragement of the Israeli government, and indeed with some discouragement, despite some discouragement from the Israeli government, have stepped up their attacks on UNRWA, accusing it of supporting Hamas, of wasting donor resources, and of artificially keeping the refugee issue alive. That is an argument that UNRWA, by registering refugees, maintains a refugee issue which wouldn't exist if it weren't for UNRWA. And you do hear that argument being made by its critics. The most powerful statement of this was the recent report written by former UNRWA counsel James Lindsay and published by the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Came out 6 weeks ago or so, I guess. The report, while purporting to be an objective assessment of how to fix the agency, that's what it was titled, Fixing UNRWA, appears, frankly, to me, to be more a thinly veiled and politically motivated attack upon it, and it has had real repercussions in the discussion about UNRWA in the American press, in Congress to some extent, and so forth. Now, in my own analytical view, the accusations made by UNRWA by these sorts of critics rarely hold up to serious examination. While the agency is accused of employing Hamas cadres, Israel actually never asks the agency to fire particular employees. And indeed, if you look at the number of UNRWA employees who've been arrested and held for any length of time, that is to say that Israel suspended them in previously Gaza down the West Bank of anti-Israeli activities, that number is actually very, very small. To demand that the agency impose a political litmus test for employment, will only employ you if you didn't vote for Hamas, is, and I think, frankly, the critics realize this, would make it extremely difficult, if not impossible, for the agency to function on the ground, and would hold it to a standard that we not only don't hold the UN agencies, but we also don't hold to donors, or for that matter, Israel in many ways. As to the suggestion that UNRWA's service provision somehow keeps the refugee issue artificially alive, this flies in the face of everything we know about historical memory and the Palestinian refugee issue. Public opinion surveys, in fact, quite interestingly show that on almost everything there is no difference in the West Bank and Gaza, where we have a lot of survey data, between the attitudes of refugees and non-refugees. That is, refugees receiving UNRWA services have exactly the same attitudes on almost everything as non-refugees, and indeed, non-refugees have the same attitude on the refugee issue as refugees do. It is not a fault line in political attitudes, which is what it would be if UNRWA services were somehow radicalizing the population and maintaining an artificial identity. I've never quite understood why people who think it's understandable that the Jewish community would want to return that to Israel after centuries would have trouble wrapping their minds around the notion that Palestinians might yearn for the return after only decades. Historical memories last a long time, and attachment to national homelands last a very, very long time. But this accusation is made against UNRWA that it is simply artificially keeping alive a refugee issue that would naturally vanish over time if it weren't for UN support. Now, without an effective response, these kinds of attacks risk establishing a dangerously inaccurate narrative about the organization and what it does and its implications, in the West at least. Already, in some donor countries, one sees political pressure to reduce funding for the agency. There's a letter circulating in Congress right now to that effect. At a time when I suggest that its needs are actually going to increase rather than decrease. And the agency itself, which hasn't responded to this as well as it might at times, the agency itself can only do so much to deal with this emerging politically motivated narrative. What is also needed is for external researchers to examine these issues in an objective and systematic way. By all means, if weaknesses are identified in the agency's service delivery, they ought to be exposed and they ought to be addressed. If there are problems with its strategy or mandate, they ought to be discussed. I'm not suggesting that we turn our blind eye to the warts of the agency, which in some cases are significant. But I am saying that the basis of such analysis ought to be the social and political realities on the ground, what it is UNRWA actually does, and not the ideological preferences and imaginings of particular analysts. third set of remarks I want to make, and then I'll throw it open. And the third set of remarks I want to make is on an issue that's always been of interest to me, namely Lebanese-Palestinian relations. More than a quarter of a century ago, and you have no idea how old it makes me feel to say this, it was the 1982 wars and the massacres at Sabra Shatila that drew my attention to the Middle East as an undergraduate student whose work up until that point had largely been on Southern Africa and non-Middle Eastern issues. I paid no attention, frankly, to the Middle East up until that point. My PhD thesis subsequently examined the political history of the Palestinian army presence in Lebanon, and much of my subsequent work has been on Palestinian refugee issues. Now, the issue of Lebanese-Palestinian relations is one of grave importance for Lebanon. And it's especially grave if what I've said before is accurate and we have no meaningful peace process for an extended period of time. I understand opposition in Lebanon to any suggestion of Palestine, of permanent resettlement here. I understand, too, the aspirations of the refugees themselves to return one day to Palestine. But the cruel reality is that it won't be happening this week, and it won't be happening next year, and it won't be happening the year after that, and maybe not even the year after that, and the year after that. That is the cruel reality of the political situation we are confronted with right now. What then should become the situation of the more than 250,000 refugees that live in Palestine? What should then be their situation until repatriation and return does one day, one hopes, become possible? Last month, the International Crisis Group published an excellent analysis of this issue, tracing the roots of the Palestinian refugee issue, looking at Lebanese policy, looking at reforms in Lebanese policy, looking at the present situation, and suggesting some areas of change, some areas of reform and policy initiative. And if you haven't read it, I suggest you go to the International Crisis Group website, download it, read it, because it really is a very, very good piece. As I say, I appreciate the sensitivity of the issue. Like the ICG report does, I also note the significant shift in both government and political attitudes on the issue in recent years. On the government side, this has been evident in the formation of the Lebanese-Palestinian Dialogue Committee, in progress, sometimes slow, on issues like that of non-IT refugees, in the government's humanitarian response during the Beirut crisis, and the efforts of the LPDC, the Reconstruction and Recovery Cell of the Lebanese government, and others in the government of Lebanon, together with UNRWA, in working together to reconstruct the Beirut camp. Clearly, the government believes, as the NBC crisis demonstrates, that the social and economic marginalization of Palestinian refugees is not only wrong, but that it is a Lebanese as well as a Palestinian interest that the camps cease to be ghettos of poverty and insecurity. I think in the government, or perhaps say more accurately, most of the government, there's a recognition that the present situation is in no one's interest. I see changes, too, at the level of Lebanese society and at the level of Lebanese civil society. While some politicians still find it useful to wave the red flag of Palestine as a way of mobilizing support, it is my belief and my hope that this kind of politics of fear will gradually become less and less effective and more infrequent in Lebanon over an extended period of time. I understand, too, the doubts and the suspicions of the refugees themselves that these changes are in fact meaningful at all. Change has been too slow in coming. Nahal Bared, home to some 30,000 people, was largely destroyed by the Lebanese armed forces in its confrontation with Fatah Islam. And frankly, in the north, it's only when it's actually reconstructed that the credibility of Lebanese government promises will be validated in the eyes of the local Palestinian population. There is a great deal to be done. NBC, the reconstruction of Nahal Bared, in accordance with the impressive NBC master plan, must progress at a timely rate. Doing so requires adequate donor resources and above and beyond the amounts that have already been pledged. Done well, the reconstruction of Nahal Bared might hold a model for improving Palestinian conditions and human security in Lebanon. Done poorly, or not finished at all, it's only going to confirm refugee suspicions about ulterior Lebanese motives. In the meantime, efforts need to be made to assure appropriate humanitarian measures, economic revitalization, and an easing of security procedures, both in NBC with regard to the refugees themselves and for the Lebanese and surrounding districts. The official Lebanese-Palestinian dialogue needs to continue, and it needs to be deepened on a range of issues. And in fairness, it has to be recognized that part of the constraint on official, formal Lebanese-Palestinian dialogue has been on the Lebanese end, but on the Palestinian end, with the inability of a factionalized Palestinian population to necessarily agree who will represent it in official fora and what its positions are. So, as one of my colleagues, the Dean Shahadi here, has sometimes said, the Lebanese-Palestinian Dialogue Committee sometimes looks like the Parliament needs to re-examine the discriminatory elements of some existing Lebanese legislation, for example, the 2001 amendments to the property law that prevented Palestinians from owning real estate, and certainly any discriminatory legislation should be avoided in the future. Now, that, in my view, can't be addressed until the elections. It's not the right time to throw that into public debate. But after the election, doing away with the sort of legislated discrimination against Palestinians on economic and social issues. No one is advocating for Palestinian citizenship, for changing Palestinian political status. But on these economic and social issues, I think that legislation needs to be re-examined, because I think, frankly, Lebanon can do much better. None of these recommendations will come as any surprise to those who've been working on these issues, so showed up to listen to me and probably heard absolutely nothing new whatsoever in the last however long I've been talking. But I would add one other thing, in fact, mainly targeted at the rest of you. This is not something, these changes in Lebanese-Palestinian relations, improving that relationship, is not something that should or can be left to officials and technocrats and agencies. Civil society has an absolutely critical role to play in pushing such changes forward, in urging such changes, in backstopping them, in helping to change attitudes, and building the foundations for an improved Lebanese-Palestinian relationship. Indeed, civil society could be absolutely vital in providing momentum to the process to ensure that it continues despite the inevitable crises, the inevitable disruptions, the inevitable political pressures that will develop. This is a part of the world, and I don't need to tell you this, and a particular part of the world where things always happen. And it's important, I think, that the positive changes we've seen be sustained through whatever it is might happen. And that can't just occur at the government level, that can't just occur at the technocratic level, that also has to occur at the level of society. Indeed, sometimes it appears that at least part of the Lebanese government is ahead of society, rather than society demanding that Lebanese-Palestinian relations be built on a more positive basis. That is what I wanted to say today. As I said, it's a sort of series of disjointed observations about negotiations, about UNRWA, and about Lebanese-Palestinian relations. So on that note, we'll sort of open for discussion.
Thanks a lot, dear friend Rex, for this really enlightening lecture, so dense. Let me take my prerogative power as chairing this panel, and starting opening the debate with two questions. I wish you have read the peace process on refugees in the light of the whole peace process, Palestinian-Israeli peace process. I think it's both of them is a fiasco for me. It's rare in the history of negotiation that the peace process starts and you end up by settler increase 3 times and the settlement size doubled. Moving from multilateral negotiation about displaced and refugees to zero. This may be big us to think about the whole enterprise. Maybe the raison d'être of the whole peace process, it was just pacification for acceleration of the colonial enterprise in Palestine, Israel. So this is my. How would you connect the negotiation of refugees to the whole enterprise of peace process? And then this leads to another question: what is the role of the international community? And how come the official position of the international community is more and more putting pressure on the Palestinians? They are pressuring us to withdraw our claims and right of return and submit to the Israeli will. you are a consultant for SIDA. Can you tell us, and I see many colleague diplomats from Canada, what is the position of Canada, for instance? And look at my eyes, because we grow up together. You feel old, and I feel old with this file. So, for instance, how come that the international community played so okay, I will not use any adjective to qualify their position. Can you okay, let's collect some...
Well, let me answer that one first. With regard to the position of the Canadian government, I will leave it to my Canadian colleagues to defend the position of the current government. That's, I think, a very clear answer on the position of the current Canadian government. You know, there have been times when the peace process has not been serious. In 2000 and 2001, I think that it was. 2000 and 2001, Stockholm, Camp David, Jerusalem, Bowling, Clinton, half of that whole period. I think that most of the primary actors were interested in reaching agreement. Of course, it doesn't mean they agree on what the agreement looks like, but I think they were interested in reaching agreement. Those negotiations were extraordinarily badly handled. I don't have time to tell the stories, but you know, the stories want to tell. One of the Israeli negotiators once told me it was the worst organized negotiations he had been to in his professional life as a negotiator and a lawyer. You know, including marital disputes, business, the worst negotiations he had ever been to. In his professional life. But I do think we had serious negotiations. The problem is the international community messed it up, and they messed it up with damaging consequences which continue to be felt for all sides, and we are now much further away from any hope for a peace process than we were in 2000. So, as I say, I don't think the whole process was a fraud, although I think there were enormous weaknesses, and the international community always has found it easier to lean on the Palestinians than it has on the Israelis, and that has had, I think, adverse consequences.
Okay, I open the floor for discussion. Rosemary, Zahir. As this remind us, she is an outstanding anthropologist, work a lot in refugee camps.
Thanks for a great presentation, very coherent and exciting. And I'd just like to ask you, don't you think it's really a problem for the eventual negotiations, that supposing that they will happen that Palestinian refugees are basically not represented at all by any of the negotiators? I mean, there has been no process through which their voice would be heard. I mean, the whole thing would collapse because of that.
Can I collect two?
Sure.
Maybe. Please.
Thanks for coming. It was a really great talk. I was just wondering, I share your pessimism about the Israeli government, but I have a little bit more pessimism about the Lebanese government, I think, than you do. Despite recent developments with Nahar and such, I think that, where do you see hope for improvement in the near future with regards to Lebanese-Palestinian relations now? What besides, I mean, the Lebanese-Palestinian Dialogue Committee it does a lot of things, but there hasn't been significant improvement in the last 2 years, and I'm wondering why you think that something good will happen soon.
Daniel,
I'm just going to articulate defense community policy.
Sorry, it's 6 o'clock on Friday. Can I dodge that issue? Passing the buck.
If you want off record, we can close that.
No. Thanks a lot. It was very stimulating presentation, but we follow your logic a bit further in part the issue of Palestinian refugees for 25 years. And you look at, that's another paper and another talk. What would be the three main long-term trends that would make the situation different? In keeping of Israeli immigration, demographics on the Israeli side and on the Palestinian side? What would allow us to think that things will be significantly different, and how, and in whose advantage? Are those trends basically to the advantage of the Israelis, or are they potentially to the advantage of the Palestinians, in a sense, an incentive to settle now rather than later?
On the first question that Rose asked about refugee stakeholders, of course, some of the negotiators have been refugees, but you're right, there has been no systematic engagement with the refugee community during periods of negotiation. Interestingly, there's sometimes more engagement with the community when there aren't negotiations, but when there are negotiations, there hasn't been any systematic engagement. That is a problem in terms of representing refugee interests and in terms of a kind of reality check about what is happening in the smoky negotiating room and whether in fact it meets the aspirations and needs and demands of the people on whose behalf you're negotiating. So I think you're absolutely right. It must be said that in many sets of negotiations, stakeholders are consulted. It's nice that they are, but there are other times where people prefer to make a deal and have calculated that it would fly. And my own sense actually is that the refugee response to any refugee deal, whenever that might be, will not just be shaped by the refugee deal, it will be shaped by the rest of it. That in other words, one can't predict refugee responses to the refugee component based just on the refugee component, but how much Palestinian national aspirations are met in other regards. That in a sense, Palestinian refugees will be willing to sacrifice more if they think they're doing so for a net Palestinian national gain than they will be if they think they are being exploited on all the other permanent status issues as well. But you're absolutely right. I mean, that stakeholder consultation hasn't worked very effectively at all, and in the sort of currently charged Palestinian political environment, the Hamas split in the territories, it becomes even harder to do. On LPDC, and not just LPDC, because there are others in the government of Lebanon dealing with this file too. The Palestinian issue in Lebanon is a bit like pushing a heavy boulder up a hill within the government of Lebanon and within Lebanese society. It is not as if there is a massive electoral demand in this country to improve the situation of Palestinian refugees. And indeed, the change that occurred, the original ministerial declaration set up LPDC, that occurred despite the politics. In other words, the politicians who've done it get no electoral advantage from doing it. They're doing it, oddly politicians sometimes do this, because they think it's the right thing to do, not because it's going to win the votes. You win votes by getting rid of LPDC. You wouldn't win votes by establishing LPDC. Things have been extraordinarily slow, but we also had, Hezbollah department, the cabinet, the political standoff, parliament not meeting, the NBC crisis. Now we're in the run-up to an election. That's been an extended period of years in which some things you can't do. The property law. There's lots of people who like to change the property law. Have you been able to do it at any point for the past two and a half years? No, it's been absolutely politically impossible. Parliament was a meeting for most of that period, and it's certainly not anything you would want to introduce in the run-up to the electoral campaign, because probably it would backfire. People would start screaming Palestine, it would become an electoral issue, you'd end up with a negative outcome. On Nahal, frankly, that is a dramatically different change, because if I may be somewhat cynical, past Lebanese practice has been to let destroyed refugee camps stay destroyed. We have a number of them that we could point to as examples of that. This is a case where the Lebanese government actually provided humanitarian assistance to the refugees. This is a case where the Lebanese government, including some of the people in this room, are engaged on a daily basis in trying to make that possible. Does it work perfectly? No, I don't think anyone who's been able to Nahal has seen conditions there and seen some of the security measures and so forth, thinks that works perfectly. But as someone who's worked on Palestinians in Lebanon since 1986, there has not been a point in Lebanese history up until relatively recently that was even conceivable as a Lebanese government response. So is it enough? No. Is it fast enough? No. Is it historically unparalleled in Lebanon? Yes. Is it all up to the government? No. I mean, the fastest way of making this move forward is to change grassroots Lebanese attitudes. That would be the fastest way of changing things. If you did that, then the work of the government would become much easier. But no, it's not. I don't think anyone who's been involved with the file thinks it's moving fast enough. But it is at least moving. And there's probably more that can be done. But again, part of that is civil society finding ways in which a realistic appraisal of what in the current political circumstances is possible, and proposing or pressuring or encouraging the government to undertake it. So I partly agree with you, but I do think it has to be seen in a broader historical context of how it used to be. I mean, I'll give you an example. Years ago, when I was in Beirut, I was going to speak on Palestinian refugees. AUB wouldn't let me speak on Palestinian refugees at the AUB because it was too politically sensitive, and we had to do it at Rosemary's house. Remember dinner? Should we get food up there?
Sorry, can I defend the AUB?
You were there. No.
Years, not 1 year ago.
No, years, many years ago.
Many years ago.
Many years ago. It was a sensitive issue. So not that I don't think I would say the rest of it.
Okay.
Well, no, hang on. There's a trend issue. I see a big negative trend, and that is Israelis have become increasingly preoccupied with the demographic issue within Israel. This indeed was the whole justification for Sharon's disengagement from Gaza and Olmert's conversion to being an advocate of a two-state solution. And indeed, Livni's conversion from being a hardliner to being a less of a hardliner and embracing a two-state solution. And Avigdor Lieberman's recent embracing of a two-state solution is the view that there are too many Palestinians already in Israel. Ironically, that has been positive in terms of Israeli acceptance of a Palestinian state. That is to say, there's a limit to how many Palestinians we want to rule over. But in terms of return to Israel, in terms of the right of return, it has been a big negative. And there was a dramatic shift, I think, with the Second Intifada, as it briefly spilled over in the fall of 2000 into northern Israel, with many Israeli Jews deciding, oh my God, we've got too many Palestinians as it is. It makes them actually more flexible in East Jerusalem, but it makes them much, because they don't want Palestinians in East Jerusalem, possibly as part of a future Palestinian state. But it has meant that society has become much less tolerant of even one refugee. And in that sense, you would probably find that most Israelis would articulate the position that the ideal number of return is 0. So that's a significant negative.
Okay, please.
I guess I have a question. We're going to let again, using your imagination. Let's say there is the right of return is never settled, and the peace process continues in sort of the impotent fashion that it's continued so far to this point. Let's say that there's very little progress in Lebanon as far as the political situation, the governance situation, and their process is still long and drawn out, and nothing really changes as far as the conditions of these refugees. What would you say to someone who wants to make a difference? Would really engaging the civil society, engaging the Lebanese government, be a solution, or what do you see the major areas where NGOs and community organizations can advance the Palestinian position in Lebanese society or improve their conditions?
Christine?
I just have a question. When you spoke about UNRWA being at risk, when I was working in the HQ at UNRWA, I heard some talk about possibly getting rid of UNRWA and making it with UNHCR and then having the states take over the services UNRWA is now providing. I just want any of your comments on that and how feasible that might be.
Thank you very much. I have a number of points. I'll go very quickly on them. First, the political polarization among the Palestinians. I would like you to shed more light on its implications on the refugee issue in Lebanon and elsewhere. This polarization, I think, is going to remain with us for some time. I don't think there's a quick fix. And it goes through the Arab world, basically. It's not purely Palestinian, as you have seen. The issue, again, to the friend here. I mean, Lebanon definitely has a hard and difficult history in terms of Lebanese-Palestinian relations. And I think Lebanon has, until now, not reconciled with its past, starting with its internal strife and civil war, let alone with the difficult period it spent with the Palestinians. So there's a reconciliation period that has never happened, basically, with the Palestinians. And I think that remains the core of the problem. Second, the use of various Palestinian factions in Lebanon by regional powers is making Lebanese also very wary. The issue of the arms outside the camp, inside the camp, is making Lebanese very wary. And it's a constant reminder of this difficult past that Lebanon went through. And this is really, if it's not addressed seriously, it will remain a pressure on politicians, on parliamentarians, to do any serious reforms and in-depth reforms. Let me remind you, Lebanon is the only place where Hamas and Fatah can sit together and talk, basically. If you look at Syria, you have just Hamas sitting there. If you look at Jordan, you have Fatah there. Even in Palestine, if you go to West Bank, I don't think you see many Hamas people there talking to Fatah. And if you go to Gaza, the same. So let me say that Lebanon has offered an enabling environment for Palestinians, even today, to sit down and talk to each other, where you have Abbas Zaki and Osama Hamdan standing next to each other and having a press conference. I have never seen this somewhere else except in Egypt recently when they tried to reconcile. I don't know if they succeeded in doing so. Last point, basically, is really if we project what you just mentioned, I would see really the best case scenario with all the other parameters still not changing very much, Israeli side, is the Palestinian refugees becoming the new Armenians of Lebanon, but without citizenship rights, basically. Where their informality, the economic informality, their political informality becomes a formal, they become a formal status, but with no citizenship. And I see this is the way that, I mean, we have new Armenians in Lebanon which are called the Palestinian refugees.
Going back to Israel's Arab community, assuming 0 refugees come back, how much is that a demographic threat to Israel's remaining a Jewish state, just as it is right now? And in the future, if a 2-state solution was achieved, how feasible do you think it is that those Arabs living in Israel are actually pushed into that state? And are there people in Israel that, I mean, you said that there's been lots of work on mechanics of returns of refugees to the West Bank and Gaza. Are there people in Israel thinking about the mechanics of kicking out their Arab population? And how much do you think, this is the first time I've heard of this recently, so if you could expand on that a little bit, I'd appreciate it.
Okay. Wow, lots of things to talk about. On civil society, and actually this relates a bit to the point Issam made about reconciliation. I mean, I think the argument can be made, and it can be made at a civil society level, and it can be made at the government level, and it can be made between those two, that having marginalized, insecure ghettos, Palestinian ghettos in Lebanon, which is what the camps in many ways are not only obviously not a Palestinian interest, but they are not a Lebanese interest. And we saw that in the Hawara. I mean, we saw that with the rights of Islam. You can see that in Hilwa. I mean, one can make I think there are powerful human rights arguments that can be made with regards to the treatment of Palestinians, and those ought to be convincing in my view. But I think one can make a powerful, much more cynical interest argument that it is not in Lebanon's interest to have the status quo continue, that there's a better situation, which doesn't involve threatening to unbalance the Lebanese system in some way, that doesn't involve the extension of political rights to refugees, but does involve an improved socioeconomic environment, recognition of civil rights in a way that reduces marginalization, reduces the risks of radicalization, reduces the risks of marginal violence. And that's a message which actually, the more that message is articulated at all kinds of levels, whether it's at the level of organizations, whether it's at the level of discussion groups, whether it's at the level of joint activities, whatever it is, I think that the more that message is articulated, the more the momentum in this process, and it's an inadequate momentum today, will be deepened. So, what I'm doing, and of course I'm partly doing it deliberately, is throwing out the challenge not just to the people who are paid to deal with these issues day in and day out, but those of you who've got time as students, as activists, as members of organizations, and so forth, think about how you can engage on it too, because that's frankly very, very important. On UNRWA, UNHCR, those who have been critical of UNRWA have at times pushed for
the replacement of UNRWA by UNHCR on the grounds that UNHCR would not, for example, recognize Palestinian refugees in Jordan as refugees because they required the citizenship of another country, and that therefore large chunks of the refugee issue would disappear under UNHCR definitional rules. On the Palestinian advocacy side, interestingly, sometimes people have pushed for UNHCR to take a larger role out of, in my view, a false view that UNHCR offers a better protection regime for refugees than UNRWA does. They don't actually do it in practice. Given that UNRWA has a General Assembly mandate, there is zero chance of UNRWA disappearing and being replaced by UNHCR. There is a chance of UNRWA being systematically underfunded over time so that it's less able to do its job. So it's not going to vanish. And indeed, I think the signals actually from the Obama administration that they're more positive to UNRWA than the Bush administration are. I've heard that recently. But there is a risk that this kind of political campaign could have implications for UNRWA fundraising, which in turn have implications for UNRWA's ability to fulfill the mandate. Sasa made absolutely key points about the combination of political factionalism and polarization in the Palestinian community, some of it locally, some of it already in Lebanon, some of it now increasingly carry over from the virtual civil war. Let's be frank, what we have in Palestine is a Fatah-Hamas civil war, and that's for all intents and purposes what it is being. The combined impact of that and the sort of interference by other Arab countries in terms of supporting particular actors and using Palestinian actors sometimes as a way of trying to influence Lebanese politics. And we all know what I'm talking about. And that makes it very difficult. That means as you move forward on one front, there are often potential spoilers who find it to their advantage to slow down progress because they feel they weren't represented, because they feel that it benefits Fatah or it benefits the other factions, because their outside sponsors or supporters want to derail particular Lebanese policies, because dealing with the issue of Palestinian arms outside the camps may or may not have implications for dealing with the issue of Lebanese arms outside the camps, and so on and so forth. So these are enormous complications. The ideal outcome, and it only marginally changes the dynamic, is that we get a national unity government in Palestine, which would just frankly be a papering over of the current reality that Hamas controls Gaza and Fatah controls the West Bank, and that over time the current hatred, and frankly having been from Palestine, hatred is not too strong a word for Fatah-Hamas relations, that the current hatred slowly diminish so that we can get a more productive relationship. But yes, it causes enormous complications. On the Israeli demographic threat, my own view is actually that the demographic threat to the Jewish character of the state posed by non-Jewish Palestinian citizens of Israel is actually zero. Because I think if you look at the numbers carefully, you'll see that Palestinians in Israel have begun to undergo a demographic transition. In other words, the reproductive rate is declining, whereas the Orthodox Jewish community is getting larger and larger, and its reproductive rate is actually higher than the Palestinian reproductive rate. So we are not, just within Israel, I'm not going to get a situation in which Palestinians become a larger share of the population. We're going to get a situation where they're about the same share of the population, but the secular Orthodox ratio is changing dramatically in one direction. Not all Israelis necessarily view the numbers the same way, but that would be my reading, frankly, of the demographic numbers. It becomes more problematic, of course, if Israel makes territorial claims into the West Bank, because then East Jerusalem and the West Bank more broadly, because then you have even more Palestinians who are under Israeli rule. Hence the acceptance of either a real two-state solution or what I think is Netanyahu's quasi-two-state solution, which is really the South African Bantustan model. And I don't say that in a rhetorical fashion. I say that analytically. It's an attempt to say, well, they don't really properly belong to our political system, so they make no claim on Israel's political system. But in practice, we're going to dominate the entity, the Palestinian Authority, the whatever we want to call it. I mean, I think that what Netanyahu has in mind is the Bantustan model. And I want to say again, I'm not throwing out the South Africa reference to be rhetorical. I think, in fact, that is an almost exact analogy for where the current Israeli government would like to go. This relates to the demographic issue as well. There are Israelis at times who advocate taking the Triangle of Galilee area and swapping it into the Palestinian state as part of a territorial swap. I frankly don't think that's likely to occur because I don't think it would ever survive a challenge in the Israeli Supreme Court. So people have talked about it, but I don't think it could actually happen within Israel. And Lieberman campaigned on the idea of loyalty oaths for Arabs in Israel, which is if you refuse to swear loyalty to Israel as a Jewish state, you would have your citizenship stripped away from you and you would become a foreign resident. And that was his campaign. His campaign was explicitly on that. I'm sure he would like to find some way of encouraging, pushing Palestinian citizens of Israel into a future Palestinian state. Whether he's able to do that or not, we'll have to see how badly that particular trend in Israel, whether it further develops or whether it reaches its natural limits. And I think that's an open question. Again, I have to say, I suspect that the Israeli Supreme Court would never, which has a, we saw just before the election, I don't know if you tracked it, briefly the Israeli Central Election Committee disbarred the Arab parties from running in Israel in the political campaign. And it lasted about 48 hours because the Supreme Court, just like this, not even without a full meeting, overruled it and said, no, you can't do that. So there are actually some internal legal constraints on the ability of politicians to push these kinds of solutions. But clearly, Palestinians in Israel are feeling, with Lieberman possibly being foreign minister, he's of course deputy prime minister for the previous government for a while, they're feeling rather nervous about their status as Palestinian citizens of Israel.
Rex, maybe two quick questions. The first one is to go back to Daniel's question on the trends. And I was wondering if you wanted to comment on the polls that we've seen during the Gaza crisis in Israel, and what I read as sort of a strong support for the offensive within the public, which seems to have been much higher than for a previous operation, and whether that's caused to worry a big change or just business as usual there. And the second question is, in terms of room of action in Washington, given the way the Israeli government is shaping up, there seems to be a lot of goodwill there. What would be your advice in terms of what can be done?
What if Barack phones me tomorrow and asks? Okay, on the polling.
Last question. Yeah, please.
Just on the point between UNHCR and UNRWA, I think UNHCR has a detention mandate, but UNRWA doesn't. Can you comment on that and on the value added of keeping UNRWA separate as opposed to just an arm underneath UNHCR? And then the second question is, if the refugees cannot return and they will not be assimilated and UNRWA is running out of funds, and this could be the case not just for Palestinian refugees. I mean, there are protracted refugee situations, I think, over 12 million people. So what do you see happening?
Okay.
Mike.
Rex, I wasn't going to let you get away. Just to tag on to Claudine's question, what are the implications for the international community about what you're saying in terms of the trends? If you're saying that final status issues are off the books now for, including the refugee file, for the foreseeable future, what does that mean for the two-state solution? I mean, we always ask this question as analysts. We're always looking for some answers. There's an international consensus that the two-state solution is what everybody wants in the international community. But you didn't answer that question tonight, so I'd like to hear your views on what it actually means. Are we moving towards an irreversible state where the two-state solution no longer is possible? And what are the timelines in your view? Thanks.
Okay, these have all been really good questions. On the polling data, the polling data up until the Gaza campaign showed that depending on when you asked it, how you asked it, somewhere between 50% and two-thirds of Israelis and somewhere between 50% and two-thirds of Palestinians more or less agreed on a Taba, Clinton, Geneva type resolution of the conflict. So actually the tragic irony has been that there's been a significant overlap. The devil is the detail, so there's a significant overlap in the sort of conceptual outcome that people imagine for peace. Despite that, of course, we haven't had a serious peace process, I think, since 2001. There has been a real hardening of attitudes on the Israeli side. It started with the Second Intifada. It grew much worse with the Second Intifada, when we got more suicide bombings within Israel. And it got much worse with the Gaza campaign too. And not to defend the views but merely to explain them, what you will hear in Israel all the time is, we withdrew from Lebanon, they keep shooting at us, we withdrew from Gaza, they kept shooting at us, and of course Palestine's still occupied. But that's the Israeli narrative. Therefore, they're not serious. They're not serious about peace. They will shoot at us from any place we leave. So why on earth would we be so stupid as to leave? And since land for peace doesn't work, this is this is the Tel Aviv taxi driver version of the Middle East. Tel Aviv is important. I mean, unless you convince Tel Aviv taxi drivers, then you don't have an Israeli government that's going to respond. The Tel Aviv taxi driver response is that, all they understand is force. We cannot, in fact, negotiate land for peace with the Arabs. They're not really interested, and therefore we'll manage Gaza the same way we managed Lebanon from December 68 up until the past 1982. Is we'll just hit them hard every time they do something to us, and they'll learn. Another thing that's happened in Israel, incidentally, that has backstopped this is certainly at the elite level, a reinterpretation of the 2006 war, which many Israeli strategic planners now view as a victory, which they didn't in 2006. They look at the quiet on the border, they look at Hamas, Hezbollah's inaction, they say, okay, that's okay. I mean, yes, we could have run the campaign much better, but heck, that's exactly what we wanted. We're fine with that. We can keep doing it. We can keep playing that. And if anything, next time there's a confrontation with Hezbollah, our mistake was to use relatively modest levels of force. Next time we'll do it like 82. I mean, the differences were about 10 to 1 in the level of military commitment in 2006 versus the level of commitment, much larger level of commitment in 1982. That has become not only the strategic narrative among military officers in Israel, that's also become the Tel Aviv taxi driver version of what's happening. And that's very, very dangerous. And that may take a while to reverse. And equally, there's a bit of the same on the Palestinian side, which is, look at Gaza. I mean, the Israelis cannot be negotiated with. All they understand is the language of force. All the negotiations have been in bad faith. There's no point. And I think this has been a dynamic that has occurred since Camp David. The Americans actually are partly responsible for it because everyone came out of Camp David after a serious negotiating process and said the other side was negotiating in bad faith. And what's happened is they've systematically delegitimized negotiations, which is only worse now when I think we have an Israeli government that doesn't want to negotiate as well on top of that. So, yeah, the public opinion situation, that trend is a very, very negative one. I'll come to the Obama, we'll ask you about the Obama administration two different ways, and I'll come to that at the end. On UNHCR and UNRWA, UNHCR has a protection mandate which it generally fulfills by saying, shouldn't do that. And UNRWA has a non-protection mandate which it usually fulfills by, you shouldn't do that. In practice, they do exactly the same thing. In private, UNHCR doesn't deploy armed guards in Goma, which force people not to kill refugees. They say, please don't kill refugees, we'll complain about it to the international community. That's exactly what UNRWA does. What UNHCR does in Congo, in terms of trying to generate international pressure on the actors to stop doing bad things, is exactly what UNRWA did in Gaza. UNRWA doesn't have a legal protection mandate, but then, this is a region where lots of people never signed the Refugee Convention in the first place. What they do is they generate public and political pressure, and in that way try to stop abuses of refugees. They don't, in fact, neither UNHCR nor UNRWA has any physical capacity to stop abuses on the ground, other than by being there and reporting them. So I would argue, and in fact, a better person to ask this is Karen Hussein, who was a UNHCR person for many years before she became an UNRWA person. She'll say, no, not really. There's not really anything that UNHCR does, despite with its mandate, that UNRWA doesn't try to do, despite not having a protection mandate in the same way. And we've seen this in UNRWA ever since the appointment of
repatriation as a mode of
UNHCR does, UNRWA could potentially do repatriation. But UNHCR doesn't do repatriation when the host country says if you send the refugee back, we'll shoot at them. Right? I mean, UNHCR only does repatriation when there is a political agreement that repatriation can occur, which is exactly what will happen with UNRWA. UNHCR does do third country. They do third country resettlement, and I don't think there would be. I mean, it would be rather politically sensitive to say, well, we'll shift Palestinian refugees to UNHCR so they can be sent to Australia or Canada and cease to have refugee status, which was what happens, of course, when you're resettlement in third country under UNHCR, your refugee status ceases. So it's not going to happen, but it does become a way. Part of that debate becomes not the protection bill, but the other part of the debate becomes a way of attacking women. Okay, there was a question about changes in the Obama administration. There's a question about what happened combine those two in a way. The Obama administration has signaled, and frankly, they're only working out what they want to do now, so it's a little unfair. They have signaled some subtle changes. They have signaled that they are more willing to engage with Hamas in the sense that they would be willing to tolerate the National Unity Government, whereas the Bush administration spent a great deal of effort trying to torpedo the National Unity Government. But they're not really going to go very far down that route unless there's a ceasefire for Gaza. The quartet conditions, we've already had almost 3/4 of the quartet suggest that those could be reinterpreted creatively. The Americans are still sticking to it, but they're sticking to it now because we don't have a ceasefire in Gaza. If we get no ceasefire in Gaza, it will be enormously difficult for the Obama administration to do anything because they'll constantly be dealing with the crisis of a rocket has just hit a kindergarten stairot, or the Israelis just bombed the hell out of prime units, and that will be the dynamic, and there won't be any. They'll get caught up in crisis management. Mitchell was a great appointment. Dennis Ross was not appointed Middle East envoy. Here's a win. So those are positive. And after all, Hillary Clinton did get PASTA into Gaza. For those of you who were following the PASTA versus rice issue, which was that the Israelis would let rice but not PASTA into Gaza because rice is a humanitarian supply, but PASTA isn't. So the American administration did engage on the PASTA issue. There's now PASTA getting into Gaza. We have our victories. If there is no peace process, I was being sarcastic there, but it actually happened. I mean, when the Secretary of State has to phone her Israeli counterparts to get PASTA into Gaza, it is just slightly all surreal. On if there's no agreement and there's no progress, what happens? I think it becomes critically important for the international community to pin down the principles on which a permanent status resolution of the conflict would be resolved, to dust off, modify, fix up the Clinton parameters plus Geneva something-ish, and declare we can't make you agree, we can't even make you negotiate, but we can say that other kinds of solutions like Bantustans are not acceptable. And indeed, Clinton may have signaled that. It was hard to parse one word, but she said something to the Israelis a few days ago, about a two-state solution being inescapable, and I suspect that inescapable was deliberately aimed at Netanyahu's attempts to escape the two-state solution. So I think you could pin down the principles on permanent status so that actors can't either offer to liberate Palestine from the river to the sea, which I don't think is going to happen, or that there will never be a Palestinian state. And I think you can be really much more muscular on upholding and even imposing international law on a variety of things, but that includes settlement activity, which the international community has been extraordinarily weak on up until this point, and in which they have all manner of ways in which they could have a much more robust response. Now, this relates to the final question on at what point does a two-state solution become impossible? It's not impossible now. I mean, despite the growth in settlers, almost all of those settlers are in the areas of the West Bank which the parties have more or less agreed will be swapped. So the bypass roads, etc., well, they can be transferred, but most of the growth in settlers has occurred in the areas that are very close to the Green Line. It's more problematic around Jerusalem than it is elsewhere, although all settlements are very problematic. However, the proliferation of settlement outposts, coupled with an Israeli government which is committed to expanding settler presence, may mean that we get rapid growth of settlements that are right in the core of the West Bank, and that becomes much harder to ever transform into a two-state solution if the next 100,000 settlers in the West Bank are not within 4 miles of the Green Line, but are deep. They're in Hebron. They're deep in the West Bank, and of course, whenever a settlement expands, whenever an outpost is increased, land gets seized for military purposes. The military post goes in, bypass roads go in, etc. So the settlement issue, I think, will be absolutely critical. Countries have all kinds of policy instruments they can use. They can demand that products be certified as settlement-free, since they don't recognize the settlements as part of Israel. They could be much sterner on immigration regulations, because it's not clear since settlement activity is a breach of the Rome Statutes of the International Criminal Court. It's not clear to me why many countries who prohibit people engaged in war crimes in entering a country allow people engaged in the organization of settlements into their countries. The British embassy, the British, you may have followed, recently backed out of a lease for their new embassy in Tel Aviv because the building owner was also involved in settlement activity. So they canceled the decision to acquire new facilities in Tel Aviv. Even if the Obama administration dusted off a word that used to be used during the Carter administration, which is illegal with regard to settlements, that word, the State Department has not used that word since the end of the Carter administration. If Obama just said the word illegal in a single interview, it would have significant effects in Israel. And the irony is that in Israel there is not strong domestic support for the settler movement. But this is the bizarre thing. The settler movement are a minority of Israel, and most Israelis have no sympathy for the settlers. And the international community has thus far, I think, failed to exploit that difference within Israeli society between the small group of settlers and the much larger group of Tel Aviv taxi drivers who may not like Palestinians, but frankly, they don't like settlers much either, and don't see why their son is off defending them in the middle of the West Bank.
Thanks a lot. You're great.